There are places in Florida that don't fit the postcard image. Places where the theme parks and white sand beaches feel like another country entirely. Where the land is older, stranger, resistant to development. The Nature Coast is one of them. A forgotten stretch of Gulf shoreline where the water runs dark with tannins, where cypress knees rise from black creeks like broken teeth, and where the forests grow so thick that sunlight barely reaches the ground. It's beautiful in a way that unsettles people, beautiful and indifferent. Rebecca Ann Torrance understood that indifference better than most. As a graduate student in marine biology at the University of Florida, she'd spent 2 summers studying the tidal ecosystems around Cedar Key, documenting species distribution in the brackish zones where freshwater springs meet the Gulf. She wasn't afraid of isolation. She'd camp alone for days, wading through mangrove channels with her field notebook sealed in a waterproof bag, marking coordinates and collecting samples in mason jars. Her advisor called her fearless. Her mother called her reckless. Both were right. On August 28, 1993, Rebecca drove her white Honda Civic west from Gainesville towards Cedar Key, planning to spend the weekend surveying a stretch of coastline near the old Suwannee fish plant. The facility had been abandoned for over a decade, its corrugated metal buildings sagging into the marsh, its wooden docks rotting into the water. But the area was ecologically rich, a transitional zone where freshwater rivers emptied into salt marshes, creating pockets of biodiversity that fascinated her. She'd told her roommate she'd be back Sunday night. She never arrived. When Rebecca's mother called the university on Monday morning, worried because her daughter hadn't checked in, the campus police initially treated it as routine. 23-year-old graduate students sometimes lose track of time. They stay an extra day in the field. They forget to call home. But Rebecca wasn't like that. She was organized, methodical, reliable. Her mother knew something was wrong. By Tuesday afternoon, the Levy County Sheriff's Office had opened a missing persons case. They found her car on Wednesday. It was parked on the shoulder of County Road 24, about 6 miles south of Cedar Key, near a narrow dirt access road that led toward the abandoned fish plant. The Honda was unlocked, keys still in the ignition. Her camping gear was in the trunk, tent, sleeping bag, propane stove, all neatly packed and unused. A half-empty bottle of warm Coca-Cola sat in the cup holder. There was no sign of struggle, no blood, no broken glass. Just an empty car on a deserted road, baking in the August heat. The initial search focused on the immediate area. Volunteers from Cedar Key joined sheriff's deputies and wildlife officers, combing through the palmetto scrub and pine flatwoods on either side of the road. The terrain was difficult, low and swampy in places, choked with sore grass and wild grapevines. The heat was punishing. Mosquitoes rose in clouds from the standing water. They searched in widening circles, calling Rebecca's name until their voices grew hoarse, but the forest swallowed the sound. By the second day, they'd brought in tracking dogs. The dogs picked up Rebecca's scent near the access road and followed it east, deeper into the woods, away from the coast. The trail led through a stand of slash pines, across a shallow creek thick with water lilies, and into a section of forest that seemed darker somehow, quieter. The handlers noticed it first, the way the birdsong faded, replaced by a stillness that felt unnatural. One of the dogs, a bloodhound named Rusty with years of experience, stopped abruptly at the edge of a small clearing. He whined, low and uncertain, then sat down and refused to go further. The handler had never seen him do that before. They found Rebecca's backpack in a tidal creek another half-mile east, partially hidden beneath a tangle of exposed roots. The green canvas was soaked, the fabric stained with mud and algae. Inside were her field notebook, a flashlight, a package of crackers, and a small first aid kit. The notebook was waterlogged but legible, filled with her neat handwriting, species lists, pH measurements, sketches of fish and crustaceans. The last entry, dated August 28th, contained only a few lines. 10:47 a.m. Water temp 84 degrees, salinity moderate. Found juvenile horseshoe crabs near South Channel. 2:33 p.m. Strange tracks near the old dock. Three-toed, very large, too deep for the substrate. 4:10 p.m. Something moving through the trees. Too large for a deer. Doesn't move right. The final sentence was smudged, as if the pencil had dragged across the wet page or her hand had jerked suddenly. There was nothing after that. No explanation, no coordinates, no indication of what she'd seen or where she'd gone next. The investigators photographed every page, sealed the notebook in an evidence bag, and continued searching. But Rebecca had vanished. The case consumed the small community. Cedar Key was the kind of town where everyone knew everyone, where strangers were noticed and remembered. The population hovered around 800 year-round residents, swelling slightly during the winter months when retirees arrived to escape the northern cold. It was a fishing village, a place of boat repair shops and seafood restaurants, of weathered docks, and men who measured their lives in tides and seasons. The idea that someone could disappear here so completely and without explanation shook people in a way that felt personal. Theories emerged almost immediately. Some believed Rebecca had gotten lost in the marsh and succumbed to the heat. August in Florida can kill quickly. Temperatures in the mid-90s, humidity so thick it feels like breathing through a wet cloth. Dehydration and heat stroke were real dangers, especially for someone alone and disoriented. But Rebecca was experienced. She'd spent 2 summers in this environment. She carried water, she knew how to navigate, she understood the risks. Others suggested something more sinister. County Road 24 was isolated, a place where someone could encounter trouble without witnesses. Drifters sometimes passed through the area, hitchhikers heading south toward Tampa or north toward Tallahassee. There were rumors of drug runners using the remote coastal areas for smuggling operations, boats slipping in and out of the mangrove channels under cover of darkness. Maybe Rebecca had seen something she wasn't supposed to see. Maybe she'd been in the wrong place at the wrong time. But there was no evidence of foul play, no signs of violence at the car, no indication of struggle near where the backpack was found. The Levy County investigators interviewed everyone they could find. Locals who lived along County Road 24, fishermen who worked the flats near Cedar Key, employees at the gas station in Chiefland, where Rebecca had stopped for fuel that Saturday morning. No one remembered seeing anything unusual. No one had heard screams or gunshots. The forest had simply swallowed her whole. Then there were the other stories, the ones people whispered about but wouldn't say out loud to investigators. Stories about the nature coast that went back generations, passed down through families like uncomfortable heirlooms. Stories about things that lived in the deep swamps and pine forests, things that didn't fit into neat categories. Old-timers in Cedar Key could tell you about fishermen who'd disappeared over the years, boats found adrift with no one aboard. They could tell you about hunters who'd gone into the woods and come back changed, unable to explain what they'd seen, but unwilling to go back. They could tell you about sounds that carried through the marsh at night, sounds that didn't match any animal in the field guides. Most people dismiss these stories as folklore, the kind of superstition that clings to isolated rural areas. But some took them seriously. An elderly woman named Doris Kincaid, who'd lived her entire 76 years in Cedar Key, told a deputy that the forest east of County Road 24 had always been wrong. She couldn't explain it better than that. Just wrong. She said her father had warned her never to go into those woods alone, especially not at dusk. When the deputy asked why, she'd shaken her head. "Some places don't want people," she said, "and if you go in anyway, sometimes you don't come back the same. Sometimes you don't come back at all." The official search continued for 2 weeks. Helicopters with infrared cameras flew grid patterns over the forest. Dive teams searched the deeper channels and sinkholes. Volunteers walked shoulder to shoulder through the palmetto scrub, checking every shadow, every depression in the ground. They found nothing. No body, no clothing, no additional evidence. Just the car, the backpack, and that final cryptic entry in her notebook. By mid-September, the active search was suspended. Rebecca Ann Torrance became another name in the files, another unsolved disappearance, another family left without answers. Her mother, Patricia Torrance, never stopped looking. She drove down from Atlanta every few months, staying in cheap motels in Cedar Key, printing new flyers, talking to anyone who would listen. She hired a private investigator who spent 3 weeks combing through the case files and walking the same trails the search teams had covered. He found nothing new. Patricia appeared on local news programs, pleading for information, offering a reward that grew larger each year as she poured her savings into it. $10,000, $20,000, eventually $50,000, but no one came forward with credible information. The years passed. The case grew cold. New investigators were assigned to the sheriff's office, and they inherited thick file boxes they'd never worked firsthand. Rebecca's face faded from the missing persons posters, the ink bleaching out in the Florida sun. The white Honda Civic was eventually released from the evidence lot and sold at auction. Life moved on, because that's what life does, even when it leaves people behind, but Patricia never moved on. She kept Rebecca's room exactly as it had been, the marine biology textbooks still stacked on the desk, the poster of a humpback whale still taped to the wall. She kept a notebook of her own, documenting every lead she pursued, every dead end she hit, every sleepless night she spent wondering what had happened to her daughter. And every August 28th, on the anniversary of Rebecca's disappearance, she drove to Cedar Key and walked the trails near County Road 24, hoping for something. A sign, a memory, a miracle. In 2003, a development company proposed clearing several hundred acres of forest near the old fish plant to build a luxury resort. The plan was ambitious. Condos, a marina, a golf course carved out of the wetlands. Environmental groups fought the project, citing damage to critical habitat. The legal battle dragged on for 2 years before a federal judge halted the development, protecting the area under the Coastal Barrier Resources Act. The forest remained untouched, and in that forest, somewhere beneath the slash pines and palmetto, Rebecca's story remained buried. Then, in November 2025, everything changed. A man named Thomas Earl Drummond was arrested in Ocala on an unrelated charge, possession of stolen property and methamphetamine distribution. Drummond was 61 years old, a career criminal with a record stretching back 4 decades. Drug offenses, burglary, assault. He'd spent most of his adult life cycling in and out of county jails and state prisons. At the time of his arrest, he was living in a run-down trailer park off Highway 441, surviving on disability payments and whatever he could sell or steal. During the booking process, deputies collected a DNA sample as part of Florida's standard procedure for felony arrests. The sample was entered into CODIS, the Combined DNA Index System maintained by the FBI. It's routine. They run thousands of samples through the database every month, cross-referencing against unsolved crimes. Most of the time, nothing comes back. But sometimes, after decades of silence, the system lights up with a match. 3 weeks after Drummond's arrest, a forensic analyst at the Florida Department of Law Enforcement Laboratory in Tallahassee flagged a hit. DNA from an unknown male collected from Rebecca Torrance's backpack in 1993 matched Thomas Earl Drummond. The sample had been extracted from skin cells found on the backpack's shoulder strap, evidence so minute it had almost been overlooked during the original investigation. But forensic technology had improved dramatically in 32 years. What had been inconclusive in 1993 was definitive in 2025. The Levy County Sheriff's Office reopened the case immediately. Detectives pulled the old files, digitized the reports, and began building a timeline of Drummond's life in August 1993. What they found was chilling. At the time of Rebecca's disappearance, Thomas Drummond had been living in Chiefland. Less than 20 miles from where her car was found, he'd been unemployed, supporting himself through petty theft and odd jobs. He knew the area intimately. He'd grown up in Levy County, hunting and fishing the same woods and waterways that Rebecca had been studying. But there was something else. Something that made the investigators pause. In the weeks after Rebecca vanished, Drummond had left Florida abruptly. He'd driven north to Georgia, then west to Alabama, drifting from town to town. He'd been arrested in Mobile in October 1993 for breaking into a storage unit. When police questioned him, he seemed agitated, nervous, unwilling to provide details about where he'd been or what he'd been doing. He served 6 months in county jail, then disappeared into the transient underworld of the Deep South. For 32 years, Thomas Drummond had moved through the margins of society, leaving a trail of minor crimes and failed opportunities. And for 32 years, Rebecca Torrance's case had remained unsolved, her mother growing older, her memory fading from public consciousness, until a routine DNA sample connected them across the decades, pulling the past into the present with the cold certainty of science. The arrest warrant was served on December 4, 2025. Drummond was charged with first-degree murder in the death of Rebecca Ann Torrance. The news hit Cedar Key like a shockwave, rippling out across the state and then the nation. Major networks picked up the story. Cold case solved after 32 years. DNA evidence leads to arrest. Patricia Torrance, now 79 years old, heard the news from a detective who drove to her home in Atlanta to deliver it in person. She sat on her couch, hands shaking, and wept for the first time in years. But the case was far from simple. Because while the DNA evidence placed Drummond in contact with Rebecca's backpack, it didn't explain what had happened to her. It didn't reveal where her body was. It didn't account for the strange details in her final notebook entry, or the way the tracking dogs had refused to continue, or the unease that still clung to those woods like morning fog. The DNA told investigators who, but it couldn't tell them how or why. And in the spaces between those questions, something else lingered. Something that didn't fit neatly into police reports or courtroom testimony, because there were details the public didn't know yet. Details the investigators had kept quiet, waiting to see how the case unfolded. Strange details that had been documented in 1993, but never fully explained. Like the tracks Rebecca had mentioned in her notebook. The search teams had found them. 3-toed impressions in the soft mud near the abandoned dock, each print nearly 15 inches long and pressed deep into the ground, deeper than seemed possible for the substrate. Wildlife officers had photographed them but couldn't identify the species. Too large for any native bird, the wrong shape for alligator. The measurements didn't match anything in their references, or the scratches found on trees near where the backpack was recovered. Long parallel gouges in the bark, starting about 8 feet off the ground and raking downward, fresh enough that sap was still seeping from the wounds. A wildlife biologist who examined them said they could have been made by a bear standing on its hind legs. But there hadn't been a confirmed black bear sighting in Levy County in over 30 years, or the smell that several searchers reported, a sharp, acrid odor that seemed to follow them through certain sections of the forest. Metallic and organic at once, like copper mixed with decay. It would appear suddenly strong enough to make their eyes water, then fade just as quickly. They'd assumed it was decomposition, maybe a dead alligator or wild hog. But they never found a source. These details had been noted in the original case files, then quietly set aside. They didn't fit the narrative of an abduction or murder. They suggested something else. Something that felt impossible to articulate in an official report. Now, with Drummond in custody, investigators had to reconcile the DNA evidence with these anomalies. They had to build a case that would hold up in court, one that explained not just what had happened to Rebecca Torrance, but how a man with no apparent connection to her had come into contact with her belongings in a remote stretch of forest on a summer afternoon in 1993. and they had to do it while ignoring the questions that kept surfacing in their minds late at night. Questions about what Rebecca had seen moving through the trees, questions about why the forest felt different in certain places, why the air seemed heavier, why experienced tracking dogs sometimes refused to go further, questions that had nothing to do with evidence or procedure, but everything to do with the uneasy feeling that there was more to this story than DNA and timelines could ever reveal. Because 32 years is a long time to keep a secret. Long enough for memories to fade and witnesses to die. Long enough for the truth to become tangled with speculation and folklore. But it's not long enough to change the land itself. And the nature coast remembers. The forest remembers. The dark water remembers. Something happened to Rebecca Ann Torrance on August 28, 1993. Something that involved Thomas Earl Drummond. But maybe, just maybe, it also involved something else. Something that doesn't appear in arrest records or forensic reports. Something that still moves through those woods when the sun drops low and the shadows grow long. Was that just coincidence? Or something we can't explain? Thomas Earl Drummond didn't look like a killer. That's what people said when his mugshot appeared on television screens across the country. He looked like what he was, a worn-out man in his 60s, thinning grey hair, deep lines carved into a face that had seen too much sun and too many bad decisions. His eyes were pale blue, watery, tired. He could have been anyone's grandfather, the kind of man you'd see buying lottery tickets at a gas station or nursing a beer at a dive bar on a Tuesday afternoon. But looks deceive. They always have. And when detectives sat down across from Thomas Drummond in the interview room at the Marion County Jail, they weren't thinking about what he looked like. They were thinking about Rebecca Torrance, about 32 years of silence, about a mother who'd spent 3 decades waiting for answers. They were thinking about the DNA evidence that put his hands on that green canvas backpack, and about the questions that evidence raised. The lead investigator was Detective Sarah Coltrane from the Levy County Sheriff's Office. She was 43, originally from Tampa, with 15 years in law enforcement and a reputation for patience. She'd worked homicides before, missing persons cases, domestic violence investigations that turned into something worse. She knew how to read people, how to wait them out, how to find the cracks in their stories. And she knew that Thomas Drummond was lying before he even opened his mouth. They'd given him his rights. He'd waived his right to an attorney, which surprised no one. Career criminals often do. They think they're smarter than the cops, that they can talk their way out of anything. Drummond sat with his hands folded on the metal table, his posture relaxed, almost casual. Like this was just another interview in a long line of interviews stretching back through the decades. "Tell me about Rebecca Torrance," Coltrane said, her voice even, controlled. Drummond blinked slowly. "Don't know that name." Rebecca Ann Torrance, 23 years old, graduate student from Gainesville. Disappeared in August 1993 near Cedar Key. You remember Cedar Key? I remember Cedar Key. Used to fish there. Used to live in Chiefland too, didn't you, back in 93? Drummond shifted slightly in his chair. Maybe. I lived a lot of places. Coltrane opened a folder and slid a photograph across the table. Rebecca's face, young and smiling, taken during her last semester at the University of Florida. Auburn hair catching the sunlight, eyes bright with intelligence and curiosity, a whole life ahead of her. "Look at her," Coltrane said. "Look at her face and tell me you don't remember." Drummond glanced at the photo, then looked away. "I told you. Don't know her. Your DNA says different. We found your DNA on her backpack, skin cells from your hands on the shoulder strap. You touched her backpack, Thomas, which means you were there, which means you know what happened to her." For the first time, something flickered in Drummond's expression. Not guilt. That would have been too simple. It was something else, something that looked almost like confusion, or maybe fear. He licked his lips, his tongue darting out nervously. "I didn't hurt nobody," he said quietly. Then tell me what happened. Tell me why your DNA is on her belongings. Tell me where Rebecca Torrance is." Drummond was silent for a long moment. Outside the interview room, through the reinforced window, other investigators watched the video feed. They'd been preparing for this moment for weeks, building their strategy, anticipating his responses, but they couldn't anticipate what came next. "I found it," Drummond said finally. "The backpack. I found it in the woods." Coltrane leaned forward slightly. "When back then? August, maybe September. I don't remember exactly." "Where?" "Near the old fish plant. I was walking through there and I saw it caught on some branches near a creek. I picked it up, looked inside. There was a notebook, some other stuff. I thought maybe I could sell it or something." "What did you do with it?" "I put it back, left it where I found it." Why, Drummond's jaw tightened, because it felt wrong. The whole area felt wrong. I didn't want nothing to do with it. Coltrane studied his face, looking for tells, for the micro-expressions that would indicate deception. But what she saw wasn't the smug confidence of a man spinning a cover story. It was something more complicated: discomfort, unease, maybe even genuine distress. "Tell me about that day," she said. "Tell me everything you remember." And slowly, haltingly, Thomas Drummond began to talk. Not in the smooth, rehearsed way of someone reciting a prepared alibi, but in the fragmented, uncertain way of someone pulling up memories that had been buried for 3 decades. Memories he'd tried not to think about, memories that had followed him through the years like a shadow. He'd been unemployed that summer, living in a rented room in Chiefland, getting by on food stamps and whatever cash he could scrounge. He'd spend his days walking the back roads and logging trails, looking for anything he could salvage or steal. Metal scrap, discarded tools, anything with value. The area around the old fish plant was a good spot, remote enough that people dumped things they didn't want anyone to see. Appliances, furniture, construction debris. Sometimes he'd find copper wire or aluminum siding he could sell. On the day he found the backpack, he couldn't remember the exact date, just that it was late summer, brutally hot. He'd been walking an old access road that curved through a stretch of pine forest east of County Road 24. The area was quiet. Too quiet. He remembered that specifically. Usually you'd hear birds, insects, the constant background hum of the forest. But that day, the silence was so complete it felt like pressure against his eardrums. He'd been walking for maybe an hour when he smelled something, sharp and chemical, like burnt metal or battery acid. It made his eyes water. He'd assumed someone had dumped hazardous waste, which was common enough in those remote areas, but he couldn't find the source. The smell seemed to move with him, fading and then returning stronger. That's when he saw the backpack. It was partially submerged in a shallow creek, the green canvas dark with water. He'd waded in and pulled it out, checking the contents to see if there was anything valuable. The notebook was soaked. There was a flashlight, some crackers, a first aid kit, nothing worth taking. But when he opened the notebook and saw the handwriting, when he read that last entry about something moving through the trees, something in him shifted. He'd looked up from the notebook and scanned the forest around him. The pine trees stood in silent ranks, their shadows deep and impenetrable. The palmetto understory was thick, creating a maze of green that could hide anything. And for just a moment, just a fleeting second, he thought he saw something move. Not an animal, not a person, just a shape, tall and dark, shifting between the trees about 50 yards away. His heart had started pounding. He dropped the backpack back into the creek and backed away slowly. His eyes locked on that spot between the trees. But there was nothing there. Just shadows and branches, just the forest playing tricks on his vision. Except the smell got stronger, and the silence got deeper, and every instinct in his body was screaming at him to run. So he did. He'd turned and walked quickly back the way he'd come, resisting the urge to break into a full sprint. He didn't look back. He didn't stop until he reached his car parked on County Road 24, and even then, his hands were shaking so badly he could barely get the key in the ignition. He never went back to that area. Within a week, he'd left Florida entirely, telling himself he needed a change of scenery, that he'd find better opportunities somewhere else. But the truth was simpler and more primal. He was scared. He didn't know of what exactly. He just knew that something about that day, about that place, had gotten under his skin in a way he couldn't shake. "Did you see Rebecca Torrance?" Coltrane asked when he'd finished. "No. I swear, I never saw her." "Did you harm her in any way?" "No. I found her backpack and I left it there, that's all." "Did you see anyone else in the area? Hear anything unusual?" Drummond hesitated. This was the moment Coltrane had been waiting for. The pause before the truth, or before another lie. She kept her expression neutral, giving him space to fill the silence. "I heard something," he said finally. "When I was walking back to my car, behind me in the trees, heavy steps, like something big moving through the underbrush. But when I looked back, there was nothing there. What do you think it was? I don't know. A bear, maybe, or a hog. I don't know." But his face said he was lying. Not about the facts, but about his conclusion. He knew it wasn't a bear. He knew it wasn't a hog. He knew it was something else, something he couldn't name or explain, something that had haunted him for 32 years. Coltrane thanked him for his cooperation and ended the interview. Outside the room, she conferred with the other detectives and the assistant state attorney who would be prosecuting the case. The DNA evidence was solid. It placed Drummond at the scene. But his story, as bizarre as it sounded, wasn't impossible. He could have found the backpack after Rebecca disappeared. He could have touched it innocently. The evidence proved contact, not murder. They needed more. They needed Rebecca's body. They needed physical evidence that tied Drummond directly to her death. And they needed to understand what had really happened in those woods on that August day in 1993. The investigative team returned to Cedar Key. They brought ground-penetrating radar, cadaver dogs, and a renewed determination to search every inch of the forest near where the backpack had been found. Technology had advanced significantly since 1993. What they'd missed then, they might find now. The search focused on a 100-acre area east of County Road 24, centered on the tidal creek where the backpack had been recovered. The terrain was challenging, low and marshy, crisscrossed with drainage channels and sinkholes. Saw palmettos grew in dense thickets, their sharp fronds making progress slow and painful. Live oaks, draped with Spanish moss, created a canopy so thick that GPS signals dropped in and out. The cadaver dogs worked in rotating teams, their handlers guiding them through the forest in systematic grid patterns. These weren't the same dogs from 1993. Those animals had long since died. But they were trained to detect the chemical signature of human decomposition, even decades old, even in difficult environments. And on the third day of the search, one of the dogs alerted near a depression in the ground, about 40 yards from the creek. The investigators marked the spot and brought in an archaeologist and a forensic anthropologist. They excavated carefully, using hand tools and brushes, documenting every layer. The soil was acidic, dark with organic matter, typical of Florida's coastal forests. As they dug deeper, the soil gave way to clay, then limestone bedrock. At 18 inches down, they found bones. Small fragments at first, then larger pieces. A femur, ribs, a partial skull. The remains were badly degraded, scattered by water and scavengers, but they were unmistakably human. And mixed with the bones were remnants of clothing, synthetic fabric that had survived the decay better than cotton or wool. Denim, the kind used in shorts. DNA testing would take weeks to confirm, but everyone standing at that excavation site knew they'd found Rebecca Ann Torrance. After 32 years, she was coming home, but finding her remains raised as many questions as it answered. The forensic anthropologist, Dr. Melissa Chen from the University of Florida examined the bones on site before they were transported to the medical examiner's office. What she found was troubling. The bones showed signs of trauma, fractures to the ribs and left arm, consistent with blunt force. But the pattern was unusual. The breaks weren't clean, the kind you'd see from a single impact or a fall. They were multiple, irregular, as if she'd been struck repeatedly from different angles. And there was something else. Scratches on several bones, long parallel grooves carved into the surface. Post-mortem, Dr. Chen determined. Made after death, but before full decomposition. What could cause marks like that, Coltrane asked. Dr. Chen shook her head slowly. Animal scavenging, most likely, teeth or claws, but the depth and spacing are unusual. I'll need to analyze them more carefully in the lab. They continued excavating the area around the remains, sifting every bucket of soil through mesh screens. They found Rebecca's sandals, the leather cracked and rotted. They found small pieces of metal, a zipper, the clasp from her watch band. They found her student ID card, the photo barely visible beneath layers of staining. And they found something else, something that didn't belong. A handful of coarse hair, dark brown, nearly black, caught in the fabric of her shorts. Long strands, each one thicker than human hair. The texture was wrong too, more like wire than fur. They bagged it carefully, labeled it, sent it for analysis. As the sun dropped toward the horizon, casting long shadows through the pines, the excavation team finished their work. They'd recovered everything they could. The remains were loaded into a transport van, headed for the medical examiner's office in Gainesville, where a full autopsy would be performed. The evidence bags were sealed and logged. The site was photographed and documented from every angle. Detective Coltrane stood at the edge of the excavation, looking down into the shallow hole they'd dug. Rebecca had been here for 32 years, buried in this lonely stretch of forest, while her mother searched and waited and hoped. The injustice of it felt heavy, pressing down like the humid air. One of the forensic technicians approached her. His name was David Marsh, mid-30s, meticulous and professional. But right now he looked unsettled, his face pale in the fading light. "Detective, there's something you should see," he said. She followed him about 20 yards from the burial site, to a cluster of pine trees growing close together. He pointed upward, directing her attention to the trunk of the tallest tree. There, starting about 9 feet off the ground and extending another 3 feet higher, were deep gouges in the bark. 4 parallel lines, each one carved into the wood with enough force to expose the pale sapwood beneath. "We found similar marks on 3 other trees in this immediate area," Marsh said, "all of them fresh when the bark was damaged. You can tell by the sap staining." Coltrane examined the marks carefully. They were consistent with what had been documented in 1993, what wildlife officers had attributed to a bear. But bears didn't climb this high. Bears didn't leave marks this deep or this regular. "What do you think made them?" she asked. Marsh hesitated. "I don't know. But whatever it was, had to be tall, strong, and had claws or something similar. I've seen marks from bears and mountain lions. This doesn't match. They took measurements, photographs, samples of the damaged bark. They documented everything according to protocol. But documentation didn't make it less strange, less unsettling. The forest was growing dark, shadows merging and deepening. The team packed their equipment and headed back to their vehicles, eager to leave before full darkness fell. As they walked the trail back to County Road 24, Coltrane felt it, that same sensation that had been described in the old reports, the same unease that Thomas Drummond had felt 32 years ago. The forest was too quiet. The air felt heavy, thick with something more than humidity. And somewhere behind them, not close but not far either, branches cracked, footsteps, something moving through the underbrush. She turned, shining her flashlight into the trees. The beam caught pine trunks, palmetto fronds, tangled vines. nothing else, just forest. But the sound continued, steady, deliberate, keeping pace with them. "Let's move," she said quietly to her team, not running, not panicking, just walking with purpose back to the vehicles. Behind them, the sounds followed for another 50 yards, then stopped. Silence rushed back in, complete and absolute. They reached the road and loaded into their vehicles without discussion. No one mentioned what they'd heard. No one wanted to name it, to make it real by speaking it aloud. They just drove away, back toward Cedar Key, back toward lights and people and the comfortable certainty of civilization. But Coltrane knew. She'd felt it the same way the searchers in 1993 had felt it, the same way Thomas Drummond had felt it. There was something in those woods, something that didn't belong in police reports or forensic analyses, something that moved between the rational world and the inexplicable, never fully revealing itself, never completely withdrawing. That night in her motel room in Cedar Key, Coltrane reviewed the case files again. She read the old reports about the tracking dogs refusing to continue. She studied the photographs of the strange tracks. She examined the statements from locals who described the area as wrong. And she thought about Rebecca Torrance, alone in those woods, writing in her notebook about something too large for a deer, something that didn't move right. What had Rebecca seen? What had she encountered in the final moments of her life? The evidence suggested Thomas Drummond had been there, had touched her backpack, had fled in fear. But had he killed her? Or had he witnessed something else? Something so terrifying that he'd run and never looked back? The autopsy would provide answers. The forensic analysis of the bones would reveal cause of death. The hair samples would be identified. The case would move forward through the legal system toward prosecution and trial. Justice would be served, or at least attempted. But in the dark spaces between facts and evidence, in the quiet moments when logic failed and instinct took over, Coltrane wondered if they would ever know the complete truth. Because some stories resist simple explanations. Some places hold secrets that don't translate into courtroom testimony, and some mysteries remain mysteries, no matter how much evidence you gather or how many questions you ask. The nature coast remembers. The forest knows. And maybe, just maybe, there are things walking through those woods that have been there longer than humans. Things that don't care about DNA evidence or police investigations. Things that move through the shadows and leave only questions in their wake. Could a man have killed Rebecca Torrance? Absolutely. Could Thomas Drummond be responsible for her death? The evidence suggested yes. But could something else have been involved? Something the investigators couldn't name, couldn't categorize, couldn't admit to believing. That was the question that kept Detective Sarah Coltrane awake that night, staring at the ceiling of her motel room, listening to the wind move through the palm trees outside. That was the question that would follow her through the rest of the investigation, whispering at the edges of every interview, every piece of evidence, every careful step toward justice. Some answers come easily. Others require you to look beyond what's comfortable, beyond what's rational, beyond what you want to believe. And sometimes the truth exists in the space between explanations, in the place where two stories overlap and neither one fully satisfies. The forest was quiet that night. But it was listening, always watching, always waiting for the next person to walk too deep into the shadows, to venture too far from the safety of roads and lights and other people. Rebecca Torrance had walked into that forest with questions about marine biology and coastal ecosystems. She'd carried a notebook and scientific curiosity. She'd been brave and intelligent and careful. And still she'd disappeared, consumed by something that existed in the gaps between known and unknown, between natural and impossible. Now, 32 years later, her bones had been found. Her story was being told. Justice was being pursued. But the mystery remained, deeper and stranger than any police report could capture. And in the woods east of County Road 24, the trees stood silent, keeping their secrets, waiting for the next chapter in a story that might never truly end. What really happened to Rebecca Ann Torrance in August 1993, the medical examiner's report arrived 3 weeks later, 47 pages of clinical language and precise measurements that reduced Rebecca Ann Torrance's death to diagrams and data points. Dr. William Hastings had performed the autopsy himself, assisted by Dr. Melissa Chen and 2 forensic pathology residents. They'd worked methodically, documenting every bone fragment, every trace of remaining tissue, every minute detail that might reveal how a 23-year-old graduate student had ended up buried in a shallow grave in the Florida woods. The cause of death was listed as blunt force trauma to the head and torso, resulting in massive internal injuries. The skull showed a depressed fracture on the left parietal bone, consistent with a heavy impact. Several ribs were broken, 2 of them fractured in multiple places. The left arm showed defensive wounds, fractures to the ulna and radius that suggested she'd raised her arm to protect herself from an attack. The manner of death was homicide. There was no question about that. Rebecca hadn't fallen. She hadn't died from natural causes or animal attack. Someone had killed her, striking her multiple times with enough force to break bones and cause fatal injuries. The timeline suggested she died within hours of her last notebook entry, probably before sunset on August 28, 1993. But it was the details in the supplementary notes that caught Detective Coltrane's attention. The anomalies that Dr. Hastings couldn't fully explain, the findings that didn't quite fit the standard patterns of blunt force trauma. The fractures were irregular, he noted. The angles and distributions suggested impacts from multiple directions in rapid succession. Not the controlled pattern you'd see from someone striking with a weapon, but something more chaotic, more violent. The force required would have been substantial. These weren't superficial injuries. Whoever or whatever had attacked Rebecca had done so with tremendous strength. And then there were the scratches on the bones, post-mortem definitely made after death but before full decomposition. Dr. Chen had examined them under magnification, comparing them to databases of known animal marking patterns. They didn't match bear claws, which would have been wider and less precise. They didn't match alligator teeth, which would have left crushing damage rather than clean scratches. They didn't match any native Florida predator in the forensic wildlife databases. The marks were parallel, 4 distinct lines, each one about a 1/4 inch apart. They were carved into the bone, with enough pressure to leave visible grooves. Whatever made them had been strong and had possessed something sharp, claws or talons, most likely. But the spacing was wrong for known species, and the depth suggested an animal larger and more powerful than anything documented in the region. It's possible we're dealing with an unknown scavenger pattern, Dr. Chen wrote in her analysis, or an anomalous specimen of a known species. Further analysis recommended. The hair samples were even more puzzling. The Florida Department of Law Enforcement Forensic Laboratory had run every test available. Microscopic analysis showed a structure that resembled mammalian hair, but with unusual characteristics. The cuticle pattern was imbricate, typical of most mammals, but the medulla was broader than normal, and the cortex showed pigment distribution they'd never seen before. DNA analysis should have resolved the question definitively, but it didn't. The results came back inconclusive. The sample contained degraded genetic material that didn't match any species in the extensive wildlife DNA databases maintained by federal and state agencies. It wasn't bear, it wasn't wild hog, it wasn't panther or bobcat or any other large predator known to inhabit Florida. The lab director, a veteran forensic scientist named Robert Timmerman, added a note to the report. Sample shows characteristics consistent with mammalian hair but cannot be definitively identified. Contamination or degradation may have compromised DNA analysis. Recommend additional sampling if possible. Detective Coltrane read the reports multiple times, sitting at her desk in the Levy County Sheriff's Office, trying to reconcile the physical evidence with a coherent narrative. Thomas Drummond's DNA on the backpack. Rebecca's remains buried 40 yards from where the backpack was found. Bones showing signs of violent trauma. Unexplained scratches. Unidentified hair. Strange marks on trees. Reports of something large moving through the forest. Two possibilities presented themselves, and neither one satisfied her completely. The first was straightforward. Thomas Drummond had encountered Rebecca in the woods, attacked her, killed her, and buried her body. The strange details, the scratches, the hair, the marks on trees, were either coincidental or the result of animal scavenging after death. Drummond's story about finding the backpack and fleeing in fear was a lie, a calculated attempt to distance himself from murder. The second possibility was more complicated and far more unsettling. Drummond had found the backpack exactly as he claimed. He'd fled because he'd encountered something in those woods, something that had frightened him enough to leave the state. And whatever he'd encountered had also attacked Rebecca, killed her, and been responsible for the physical evidence that didn't quite fit any known pattern. The problem was that the second possibility required accepting something that couldn't be proven, something that existed outside the boundaries of conventional forensic science. It required believing that there was something in the Nature Coast forests that didn't appear in field guides or wildlife databases, something large and dangerous and unknown. Coltrane wasn't ready to go there, not officially, but privately. In the quiet hours when she reviewed the evidence alone, she couldn't shake the feeling that the case was bigger and stranger than a simple murder. The state attorney's office was preparing to prosecute Thomas Drummond for first-degree murder. The DNA evidence linking him to the crime scene was solid. They had his contradictory statements, his history of violence, his unexplained flight from Florida shortly after Rebecca's disappearance. They had motive, robbery perhaps, or an opportunistic attack on an isolated victim. They had means. Drummond was physically capable of inflicting the injuries Rebecca sustained, and they had opportunity. He'd admitted being in the area at the relevant time. The case seemed straightforward. But Assistant State Attorney Jennifer Marquez, who would be leading the prosecution, shared Coltrane's unease about the unexplained details. "The defense is going to hammer us on the anomalies," Marquez said during a strategy meeting. "The scratches on the bones, the unidentified hair, the marks on the trees. They're going to argue that someone or something else killed Rebecca, and their client just happened to find her backpack afterward." "Can we exclude that possibility?" asked one of the other detectives. "Not definitively," Coltrane admitted. "The physical evidence suggests a violent attack, but we can't prove Drummond inflicted those specific injuries. The scratches and the hair don't match anything in our databases, so we focus on what we can prove," Marquez said. "His DNA on her belongings, his presence at the scene, his flight from the area, his criminal history. We build a circumstantial case that points to his guilt and let the jury decide." It was sound legal strategy. Circumstantial cases were won all the time, especially when the evidence created a clear pattern. But Coltrane knew that justice wasn't just about winning convictions, it was about truth, and she wasn't entirely certain they had the whole truth. She decided to make one more trip to Cedar Key, not as part of the official investigation, but to talk to people who'd lived in the area for decades, people who might know things that had never made it into police reports. Sometimes the most important information came from conversations that happened off the record, from stories that people only told when they trusted you wouldn't laugh or dismiss them. She started with Doris Kincaid, the elderly woman who'd told a deputy in 1993 that the forest east of County Road 24 had always been wrong. Doris was 84 now, living in a small house on the outskirts of Cedar Key, surrounded by old photographs and the accumulated memories of a long life. She invited Coltrane in, offered sweet tea, and listened carefully as the detective explained what they'd found. "So you found that girl," Doris said quietly, "after all these years?" "Yes, Ma'am, and we've arrested someone, but I'm trying to understand what happened to her, and some of the details don't quite add up." Doris nodded slowly. "Because it wasn't just a man, was it?" Coltrane felt her pulse quicken. "What do you mean? My father worked the timber crews back in the 30s and 40s, Doris said. They'd cut pine all through this area, float the logs down to the Gulf. He told me stories about things they'd see in the deep woods, things that didn't match anything they knew, tracks that were too big, too strange, sounds that carried through the trees at night, like nothing you'd ever heard. What kind of sounds? He said it was like a scream and a roar, mixed together, made your bones hurt to hear it. And the smell. He always mentioned the smell, sharp and bitter, like metal burning. Said it meant something was close, something you didn't want to meet. Coltrane thought about the reports from the 1993 search, the acrid odor that had appeared and disappeared. Did he ever see what made the sounds once? He was working a section near the Wakasasa River, and he saw something moving through the palmettos about 50 yards away. "Big," he said. "Taller than a man, moving on 2 legs, but hunched forward. Dark fur or hair covering the body." He only saw it for a few seconds before it disappeared into the thick brush. He never went back to that area again. Did he tell anyone? He told the crew boss, who told him to keep his mouth shut. Couldn't have the men getting spooked, refusing to work certain sections. So my father kept quiet. But he told me years later, when I was old enough to understand. He said there were places in this world where the wilderness was still wild, where things lived that didn't want to be found. And the smart thing was to respect that, to stay out of those places. Other residents shared similar stories. A retired commercial fisherman named Earl Simmons described seeing something wading through the shallow water near the Suwannee fish plant one evening in the early 80s. It was nearly dark, and he'd been checking his nets. The figure had been tall, moving deliberately through the chest-deep water, its silhouette strange and unsettling against the sunset. When he'd called out, thinking it might be someone in trouble, the figure had turned toward him. He couldn't make out details, just the shape and the way it moved. Smooth but wrong somehow, not quite human. "I didn't stick around to get a better look," Earl said. "I pulled my nets and got out of there fast as my boat would take me. Never went back to that spot." A woman named Claire Henderson, who'd grown up near Chiefland, remembered finding strange tracks on her family's property in the mid-90s. 3-toed prints in the mud near their pond, each one bigger than a dinner plate. Her father had told her they were from a large crane or stork, but even as a teenager, she'd known that wasn't right. Crane tracks didn't sink that deep. They didn't have that kind of spacing. The stories accumulated, building a folklore that stretched back generations. Not everyone believed them. Many dismissed them as tall tales, the kind of exaggeration that grows naturally in rural communities where isolation and imagination feed each other. But the consistency was striking. The descriptions were similar. Something large, something bipedal, something that moved through the woods and swamps with a purpose that suggested intelligence. The Native American history of the region added another layer. The area had been inhabited by indigenous peoples for thousands of years before European contact. Creek and Seminole tribes had lived and hunted in these forests, and their oral traditions contained references to creatures that didn't fit standard categories. Forest spirits, some called them, shapeshifters that walked the boundary between human and animal. Most anthropologists interpreted these stories as mythology, symbolic representations of natural forces or spiritual concepts. But what if some of those stories had been based on observation? What if the indigenous peoples had encountered something real, something that still existed in the most remote sections of the Nature Coast? Coltrane knew she was venturing into territory that would never be admissible in court, that had no place in an official police investigation. But she couldn't ignore the pattern. Too many people across too many decades describing too many similar experiences. And now, physical evidence that didn't quite match anything known to science. She visited the University of Florida and met with Dr. Robert Chen, a wildlife biologist who specialized in Florida ecosystems. She showed him the photographs of the tree scratches, the measurements, the descriptions. He studied them carefully, his expression thoughtful. "It's not impossible that we have species in Florida that haven't been fully documented," he said. "The state has vast areas of wilderness, particularly in the coastal regions and the Everglades. New species are discovered regularly, though usually they're insects or small reptiles. Something large enough to make these marks would be harder to miss, but not impossible. Not impossible, just highly improbable. A large mammal requires a substantial habitat range and a viable breeding population. Something that size would leave extensive evidence, scat, hair, tracks, territorial markings. We'd have trail camera footage, we'd have vehicle strikes, we'd have confirmed sightings. The absence of consistent documentation makes it unlikely." "What if it's not a naturally occurring species?" Coltrane asked. "What if it's something that was introduced, or something that migrated from elsewhere?" Dr. Chen considered this. "There have been cases of exotic species establishing themselves in Florida. Pythons in the Everglades, for example. Monitor lizards in various locations. But those are documented now. We know they're there. This would require an animal that's been avoiding detection for decades, which suggests either exceptional intelligence or very small numbers. Or both," Coltrane said quietly. She returned to the crime scene one final time, alone. It was late afternoon, the sun slanting through the trees at that golden angle that makes everything look both beautiful and melancholy. She walked from County Road 24 along the access road, following the path Rebecca would have taken 32 years ago. The forest was alive with sound now. Birds calling, insects humming, a light breeze rustling through the palmetto fronds. She reached the spot where Rebecca's remains had been found. The excavation had been filled in, the earth disturbed, but already beginning to heal. In a few more months, vegetation would cover the site completely. The forest would reclaim it, erasing the physical traces of tragedy. Coltrane stood there for a long time, trying to imagine what had happened. Rebecca, walking through this same forest, notebook in hand, documenting the ecosystem she loved. Stopping near the creek, noticing something unusual, writing that final entry about something large moving through the trees, something that didn't move right. What had she seen? A man, Thomas Drummond perhaps, approaching with violent intent, or something else, something that had emerged from the deep woods, drawn by curiosity or hunger or territorial instinct. The attack would have been sudden, brutal, overwhelming. The defensive wounds on her arm suggested she'd tried to fight back, to protect herself. But against such force, such violence, she'd had no chance. She'd fallen here, her life ending in this quiet place, far from help, far from anyone who could have saved her. And then, what had Drummond found her body and panicked, burying her in a shallow grave before fleeing? Or had something else done that, dragging her remains to this spot, covering them with earth and leaves, in some instinctive behavior that mimicked burial? The physical evidence could support either interpretation. The psychological evidence, Drummond's fear, his abrupt departure from Florida, his 32 years of silence, suggested he'd witnessed something traumatic, something that had broken something inside him. Guilty men often acted that way. But so did witnesses to horror. As Coltrane stood in the fading light, she felt it again. That sensation of being watched, of not being alone. The forest was too quiet. The birdsong had stopped. Even the insect drone had faded. The silence pressed against her ears, thick and expectant. She turned slowly, scanning the trees. Shadows pooled between the trunks, deep and impenetrable. Something could be standing there 50 yards away, perfectly still, and she'd never see it. The thought sent a chill down her spine, despite the humid warmth. "Rebecca," she said quietly, speaking to the empty air, "I'm going to find out what happened to you. I promise." The silence held for another moment. Then, like a switch being flipped, the forest sounds returned. Birds called. Insects resumed their hum. The spell, if that's what it had been, broke. Coltrane walked back to her vehicle, her footsteps quick and purposeful. She didn't look back. She'd learned that lesson from the stories. Never look back when the forest feels wrong. Just keep moving, keep walking, keep putting distance between yourself and whatever lives in the shadows. The trial was scheduled for March 2026. Thomas Earl Drummond pleaded not guilty, and his public defender was preparing a vigorous defense. They would argue that the DNA evidence only proved contact with the backpack, not murder. They would highlight the unexplained physical evidence, the scratches, the hair, the inconsistencies in the injury patterns. They would suggest that something else had killed Rebecca Torrance, and their client had simply been in the wrong place at the wrong time. The prosecution would counter with circumstantial evidence, with Drummond's history, with the statistical improbability of his innocent explanation. They would bring in forensic experts to testify about the bones, the DNA, the timeline. They would paint a picture of an opportunistic predator who'd attacked an isolated victim and then spent decades running from justice. And somewhere in the middle of those competing narratives, the truth would exist. Not the complete truth, perhaps. Not the kind of truth that answered every question or resolved every mystery, but enough truth to satisfy the requirements of law, to provide closure for Rebecca's mother, to mark the end of one story and the beginning of whatever came next. Patricia Torrance had been notified when they found her daughter's remains. She'd driven to Gainesville for the autopsy results, sat in Detective Coltrane's office, and listened to the clinical details with a composure that seemed almost inhuman. Only her hands betrayed her emotions. They shook constantly, trembling in her lap like captured birds. "Will you tell me what you really think?" Patricia asked when the official briefing was finished. "Not the legal version. What do you believe happened to my daughter?" Coltrane chose her words carefully. "I believe she encountered something dangerous in those woods. I believe Thomas Drummond was there, and his DNA proves it. I believe Rebecca died violently, and her death wasn't an accident. Beyond that," she paused, "beyond that, I think there are aspects of this case we may never fully understand." Patricia nodded slowly. "When Rebecca was a little girl, maybe 6 or 7 years old, we went camping in the Smoky Mountains. Middle of the night, something walked through our campsite, something big. We heard it breathing, heard it moving around our tent. My husband wanted to look outside, but I wouldn't let him. Some instinct told me to stay quiet, stay still, wait for it to leave. In the morning, we found tracks, bear probably, but I've never forgotten that feeling, knowing something wild and powerful was just a few feet away, separated from us by nothing but a thin layer of nylon." She looked at Coltrane with eyes that had seen too much grief. "I think Rebecca felt that way in her last moments. I think she knew something was there, something she couldn't fight or escape. And I think she was brave until the very end." "Yes, ma'am," Coltrane said quietly. "I believe she was." The investigation continued through the winter. More evidence was processed, more witnesses interviewed, more pieces of the puzzle examined and catalogued. But the central mystery remained. A young woman had walked into the Florida woods on a summer afternoon and never walked out. A man's DNA had been found at the scene. And in the spaces between facts, in the gaps where evidence ended and speculation began, something else lingered. Something that defied easy categorization, that resisted the neat boundaries of police reports and forensic analyses. The nature coast kept its secrets. The forest remembered. And in the deep woods east of County Road 24, where the shadows grew long and the silence sometimes felt too complete, the trees stood witness to truths that might never be spoken aloud. Was it just a man who killed Rebecca Torrance? Or was there something else in those woods that day, something that had existed there long before humans arrived and would remain long after they were gone? The answer might lie somewhere between those possibilities, in the terrible place where human evil intersects with natural forces we don't fully understand. In the end, perhaps it didn't matter which explanation was more accurate. Rebecca was still gone. Her mother was still grieving. Justice was still necessary, but the questions remained, persistent and unanswerable, echoing through the years like footsteps in the forest, always just behind you, always just out of sight. The trial began on March 10th, 2026, in the Levy County Courthouse, a modest brick building in Bronson, where Spanish moss hung from the live oaks outside, and the air conditioning struggled against the early spring humidity. The courtroom was small, intimate in a way that made the proceedings feel even more intense. Every word echoed, every gesture was visible to everyone present. Patricia Torrance sat in the front row behind the prosecution table, her hands folded in her lap, her face composed, but her eyes never leaving Thomas Earl Drummond. He sat beside his public defender, wearing an ill-fitting suit, his expression carefully neutral. He'd lost weight since his arrest, his face gaunt, his pale blue eyes watery and distant. He looked older than 61. He looked like a man who'd been running for a very long time and had finally been caught. The jury selection had taken 3 days. Finding 12 people who hadn't formed opinions about a 32-year-old cold case that had generated national headlines proved challenging. But eventually they assembled a panel, 6 men, 6 women, ranging in age from 24 to 67. They came from Levy County and neighboring jurisdictions, people who understood the nature coast, who knew the forests and waters, who could comprehend both the beauty and the danger of that landscape. Assistant State Attorney Jennifer Marquez delivered the opening statement with quiet intensity. She walked the jury through Rebecca's life, her passion for marine biology, her dedication to her research, her careful nature. She described the afternoon of August 28th, 1993, when Rebecca drove to Cedar Key with her field notebook and her camping gear, planning a weekend of research that would never happen. Rebecca Ann Torrance was 23 years old, Marquez said, her voice steady and clear. She had her whole life ahead of her, a career in marine science. Maybe a family someday, dreams and plans and possibilities. All of that was taken from her on that August afternoon, taken by the defendant, Thomas Earl Drummond, who encountered Rebecca alone in those woods and saw an opportunity. She outlined the evidence, the DNA on the backpack, Drummond's presence in the area, his abrupt flight from Florida, his decades of silence. She acknowledged the mysterious elements, the unexplained details, but framed them as distractions from the central truth. The defense will try to confuse you, she said. They'll point to strange evidence and suggest alternative theories. They'll try to convince you that something other than human violence killed Rebecca Torrance. But the science is clear. The defendant's DNA was on her belongings. He was there. He fled, and Rebecca died from injuries inflicted by human hands, not animal claws or mysterious creatures. This is a case about murder, plain and simple. And the evidence will prove beyond reasonable doubt that Thomas Earl Drummond is responsible. The defense attorney, a tired-looking man in his 50s named Marcus Webb, took a different approach. He didn't deny that his client had been in the woods that day. He couldn't. The DNA evidence was irrefutable. Instead, he built a narrative around fear, around the unexplained, around reasonable doubt. My client made mistakes, Webb told the jury. He picked up property that didn't belong to him. He left the scene without reporting what he found. He ran instead of staying to face questions. But making mistakes doesn't make you a murderer. Being in the wrong place at the wrong time doesn't make you a killer. He described Drummond's account, finding the backpack, feeling the overwhelming sense of wrongness in that place, fleeing in terror. He detailed the physical evidence that couldn't be explained by human agency, the scratches on the bones, the unidentified hair, the marks on the trees. Something killed Rebecca Torrance, Webb said, something violent and powerful, but the prosecution hasn't proven it was my client. They've proven he touched a backpack, that's all. Everything else is speculation and circumstantial inference. And in this country, we don't convict people based on speculation. We require proof. We require certainty. And that certainty doesn't exist in this case. The prosecution's case unfolded over 2 weeks. They called forensic experts who walked the jury through the DNA analysis, explaining how skin cells transfer, how samples are processed, how matches are determined. The testimony was technical, dense with scientific terminology, but the conclusion was simple. Thomas Drummond's DNA was on Rebecca's backpack. The odds of a random match were astronomical, effectively impossible. Dr. William Hastings testified about the autopsy, describing the injuries in clinical detail, the skull fracture, the broken ribs, the defensive wounds. He showed photographs, not of the body itself, which would have been too disturbing, but of the bones, marked and labelled, each injury documented and explained. These injuries were inflicted by significant force, Dr. Hastings said. The pattern suggests multiple impacts from different angles. This wasn't a single blow. This was a sustained attack. Could these injuries have been caused by an animal, Webb asked during cross-examination? The primary injuries? No. The skull fracture and rib fractures are consistent with blunt force trauma from a heavy object or repeated strikes. Not consistent with animal predation. What about the scratches on the bones, the post-mortem markings? Dr. Hastings hesitated. Those are more difficult to explain. They appear to have been made by something sharp, possibly claws or talons. But the pattern doesn't match any known species in our databases. So something unknown could have been involved. Objection, Marquez said. Speculation. Sustained, the judge ruled. Webb pressed on. Dr. Hastings, is it possible that an unidentified animal scavenged the remains after death? It's possible, yes, though the marks are unusual. Unusual enough that you can't definitively identify what made them. That's correct. The hair evidence proved even more problematic for the prosecution. Robert Timmerman from the FDLE Forensic Laboratory testified about the analysis, the testing procedures, the inconclusive results. He maintained professional composure, but his testimony revealed the limits of forensic science. We couldn't match the sample to any known species, Webb asked. That's correct. The DNA was too degraded to produce a conclusive result. But it's definitely not human. The structure suggests mammalian hair, but beyond that, we couldn't determine origin. So it's possible this hair came from an unknown animal. It's possible the degradation prevented identification, or that contamination affected the sample, or that it's from a species not in our reference databases, which would include an unknown species. Timmerman shifted uncomfortably. Theoretically, yes. The prosecution worked to minimize the damage, calling additional experts who testified about contamination, about degradation, about the challenges of analyzing biological evidence that had been exposed to Florida's humid environment for over 3 decades. They argued that the hair was likely from a known animal, just too degraded to identify properly. They emphasized that the unexplained details didn't change the central facts. Drummond's DNA, his presence, his flight. But Webb had planted seeds of doubt, and in a criminal trial, doubt was powerful. The most dramatic moment came when Thomas Earl Drummond took the stand in his own defense. It was a risky move. Prosecutors would tear into him during cross-examination, highlighting every contradiction, every inconsistency in his story. But Webb had calculated that the jury needed to hear directly from his client, needed to see his fear and confusion, needed to understand that he'd been running not from guilt, but from terror. Drummond spoke slowly, his voice rough from years of cigarettes and hard living. He recounted finding the backpack, reading the notebook entry, feeling the wrongness of that place. His hands trembled as he talked, and his eyes grew distant, as if he were seeing something the rest of the courtroom couldn't. "I knew I should have left it alone," he said. "Soon as I picked it up, I knew. But I looked inside anyway. And when I read what she wrote about something moving through the trees—" He trailed off, shaking his head. "That's when I heard it." "What did you hear?" Webb prompted gently. "Footsteps. Heavy ones. Not regular, like a person walking. More like, I don't know how to describe it. Like something big moving slow and deliberate, and the smell hit me, like burning metal, made my eyes water. What did you do?" "I dropped the backpack and I ran. Didn't look back, didn't stop until I got to my car, and even then, I felt like something was watching me, following me. So I left, drove to Georgia that same night. I couldn't stay there. I just couldn't." "Why didn't you report what you found?" Drummond's jaw tightened. "Because I was scared. And because I knew how it would look. I had a record. I was unemployed. I was in the wrong place. Who was going to believe me? So I ran instead. I know that was wrong. I know I should have stayed and told the police. But I wasn't thinking straight. I was just trying to get away from that place." Marquez's cross-examination was brutal and precise. She hammered at every inconsistency in his story, every gap in his timeline. She forced him to admit he'd been using drugs that summer, that his memory was unreliable, that he'd lied to police before. She made him acknowledge that he'd had 32 years to craft this story, 32 years to create a narrative that painted him as a victim rather than a perpetrator. "You touched Rebecca Torrance's backpack," Marquez said, her voice sharp. "Your DNA proves it. You were in those woods on the day she disappeared. You left Florida immediately afterward. And you expect this jury to believe that was all just coincidence? I didn't hurt that girl," Drummond said, his voice breaking. "I swear on everything I am, I didn't hurt her. But you didn't help her either. You found her belongings and you ran. If you were innocent, if you truly found that backpack after she was already gone, why didn't you call the police? Why didn't you try to help?" Drummond had no good answer, because there was no good answer. No matter what the truth was, his actions had been cowardly and selfish. He'd left Rebecca in those woods, dead or dying, and saved only himself. The prosecution's rebuttal case focused on Drummond's character, his history, the pattern of his life. They called witnesses who testified about prior violent incidents, bar fights, domestic disputes, threats made against neighbors. They painted a picture of a man capable of explosive violence, of a predator who'd finally graduated from minor crimes to murder. Detective Sarah Coltrane was the final witness. She walked the jury through the investigation, the evidence recovery, the timeline reconstruction. She was professional and thorough, careful not to overstate the conclusions or venture into speculation. But when Webb cross-examined her about the unexplained elements of the case, she was equally careful not to dismiss them. "You documented unusual physical evidence at the scene," Webb said. "Scratches on trees, strange tracks, unidentified hair. Do those findings concern you?" "They're part of the evidence," Coltrane said evenly. "We document everything, whether we can explain it or not. But you can't explain these particular findings." "Not definitively, no. Is it possible something other than Mr. Drummond was involved in Rebecca Torrance's death?" Coltrane paused, choosing her words carefully. "It's possible there were multiple factors. The physical evidence shows blunt force trauma consistent with human violence. But there are also elements that don't fit standard patterns. Whether those elements are connected to the cause of death or represent separate incidents, I can't say with certainty." It was an honest answer, and honesty was what the moment required. Coltrane had spent months with this case, had walked those woods, had felt the unease that seemed to permeate that place. She knew what the evidence proved, and she knew what it didn't prove. and she wasn't willing to lie to make the prosecution's case easier, even if that meant introducing doubt. The closing arguments lasted a full day. Marquez summarized the evidence methodically, connecting each piece to the central narrative of Drummond's guilt. She acknowledged the mysteries, but framed them as irrelevant to the core question: did Thomas Earl Drummond kill Rebecca Ann Torrance? The DNA said yes. His actions said yes. His flight said yes. Some questions don't have perfect answers, she told the jury. Some evidence doesn't fit neatly into categories, but that doesn't change the fundamental truth. Rebecca Torrance went into those woods alive and came out dead. The defendant was there. His DNA proves it. His behavior proves it. And your verdict should reflect that truth. Webb's closing was quieter, more philosophical. He talked about doubt, about the burden of proof, about the difference between suspicion and certainty. He walked the jury through the unexplained evidence piece by piece, building a mosaic of ambiguity. The prosecution wants you to ignore what doesn't fit their theory, he said. They want you to focus only on the DNA and pretend the rest doesn't matter. But it does matter, because if there's even a possibility that something else was involved, if there's even a chance that my client's terror was real and his flight was understandable, then you cannot convict. Reasonable doubt exists in this case. It exists in the scratches on those bones, in the hair that can't be identified, in the marks on those trees. It exists in the gap between what we know and what we can prove. And where reasonable doubt exists, you must acquit. The jury deliberated for 4 days. They requested transcripts of testimony, photographs of evidence, clarifications on legal standards. They sent notes to the judge, asking detailed questions about DNA analysis, about the definition of reasonable doubt, about the relationship between physical evidence and circumstantial inference. The courtroom was tense during those 4 days. Patricia Torrance sat in the same seat every morning, waiting. Detective Coltrane attended when her schedule allowed, watching the jury room door, trying to read meaning into the length of deliberation. Long deliberations could mean disagreement, conflicting interpretations of evidence, jurors struggling to reconcile competing narratives. On the 4th day, late in the afternoon, the buzzer sounded. The jury had reached a verdict. The courtroom filled quickly. Media crews crowded the hallway outside, cameras ready to capture reactions. Inside, the atmosphere was electric with anticipation. Patricia Torrance gripped the edge of the wooden bench, her knuckles white. Thomas Drummond stood beside his attorney, his face pale, his eyes fixed on the jury as they filed in. The judge asked the standard question. Members of the jury, have you reached a unanimous verdict? The foreperson, a retired schoolteacher from Cedar Key, stood. We have, Your Honor. What say you in the matter of the state of Florida versus Thomas Earl Drummond on the charge of first-degree murder? We find the defendant guilty. The word hung in the air for a moment, reverberating. Then sound rushed back in. Patricia's sob of relief, the murmur of spectators, the scratch of pencils as reporters wrote frantically. Drummond's head dropped forward and his shoulders shook. Whether from grief or relief or simply exhaustion, it was impossible to say. The judge polled the jury individually. Each one confirmed the verdict, guilty. 12 voices, 12 citizens who'd examined the evidence and concluded that despite the mysteries, despite the unexplained elements, Thomas Earl Drummond had killed Rebecca Ann Torrance. The sentencing hearing was scheduled for 2 weeks later. Under Florida law, first-degree murder carried either life imprisonment or the death penalty. The prosecution would argue for the maximum sentence, emphasizing the brutality of the crime, the decades of deception, the lack of remorse. The defense would plead for leniency, citing Drummond's age, his difficult life, whatever mitigating factors they could find. But the verdict itself brought a kind of closure, not perfect closure. Nothing about this case was perfect, but closure nonetheless. The legal system had rendered judgment. A jury of peers had examined the evidence and determined guilt. Justice, in its imperfect human form, had been served. Patricia Torrance stood outside the courthouse afterward, surrounded by reporters reading from a prepared statement. Her voice was steady now, strengthened by the verdict, by the validation that her daughter's death had been recognized and addressed. "For 32 years, I've carried the weight of not knowing," she said. "Not knowing what happened to Rebecca, where she was, whether she'd suffered. Today, some of that weight has lifted. I know where my daughter is. I know who took her from me. And I know that person will face consequences. That's not everything. It doesn't bring Rebecca back. But it's something, and after 3 decades of nothing, something feels like a miracle." She answered a few questions, then retreated to a waiting car. She'd done what she needed to do. She'd survived. She'd persisted. She'd gotten her answer. Now she could finally begin the work of true grieving, of processing loss that had been frozen in uncertainty for so long. Detective Coltrane watched from the courthouse steps, feeling a complex mix of satisfaction and unease. They'd gotten the conviction. The evidence had held up. The jury had seen through the defense's attempts to create doubt. By every professional measure, this was a successful investigation. But the mysteries remained. The scratches on the bones, the unidentified hair, the marks on the trees, the reports from decades of witnesses who'd experienced something strange in those woods, the feeling that had gripped her when she stood at the crime scene, the sensation of being watched by something that existed just beyond perception. She'd done her job. She'd built the case, gathered the evidence, testified honestly. But honesty meant acknowledging what she didn't know as well as what she did. And there was so much about this case that resisted explanation. Later that night, alone in her apartment in Gainesville, Coltrane opened her personal notebook. Not an official case file, just her own thoughts and observations. She wrote about the trial, about the verdict, about Patricia Torrance's relief, and then she wrote about the questions that lingered. Did Thomas Drummond kill Rebecca Torrance? The jury said yes, and I believe they're right. His DNA, his presence, his flight, it all points to guilt. But was he alone? Was he the only thing in those woods that day? Or did Rebecca encounter something else first, something that attacked her, and Drummond simply witnessed the aftermath? The evidence doesn't give us perfect clarity. Maybe it never could. Maybe some events are too complex, too layered, to reduce to simple cause and effect. Human violence intersecting with natural forces, known predators and unknown ones. The explained and the inexplicable, woven together so tightly we can't separate them. What I know, Rebecca is dead. Drummond was there. Justice has been served, at least in legal terms. What I don't know, everything else. The full truth of what happened in those woods, whether the forest itself played a role, whether something ancient and wild was involved, whether the nature coast holds secrets we're not equipped to understand. Maybe that's okay. Maybe not everything needs to be explained. Maybe sometimes we do our best with what we have and accept that mysteries will remain. She closed the notebook and looked out her window at the darkness beyond. Somewhere out there, the nature coast stretched along the Gulf, its forests deep and silent, its waters dark with tannins. Somewhere in those woods, the place where Rebecca had died was slowly returning to wilderness, the disturbed earth healing, the trees growing, the natural order reasserting itself. And maybe, just maybe, something still moved through those shadows, something that had been there before humans arrived and would remain after they were gone, something that didn't care about trials or verdicts or the human need for answers. The indigenous peoples had understood this. The old-timers who'd lived on the nature coast for generations had understood this. There were places where the wilderness was still truly wild, where the boundaries between known and unknown grew thin, where the rational world and something older intersected. Rebecca Torrance had walked into one of those places. She'd carried her scientific training and her careful observations and her belief in natural explanations. And she'd encountered something that challenged all of that. Maybe it was just Thomas Drummond, a violent man who saw an opportunity. Maybe it was something else entirely. Maybe it was both. The trial had answered the legal question, guilty, case closed. But the deeper mystery remained open, would always remain open, because some questions don't have answers that fit in courtroom testimony or forensic reports. Thomas Earl Drummond was sentenced to life imprisonment without possibility of parole. He was transferred to a maximum security facility in North Florida, where he would spend the remainder of his days among other men who'd taken lives, destroyed families, chosen violence over humanity. He never confessed to killing Rebecca. Even after the verdict, even facing life behind bars, he maintained that he'd found her backpack and fled in fear. Maybe he was lying. Maybe he'd convinced himself of his own innocence through decades of self-deception. Or maybe, in his broken and confused way, he was telling the truth as he understood it. Maybe he'd witnessed something that shattered his sense of reality, something so terrifying that running was the only response his mind could process. The forest near County Road 24 remained undeveloped. The environmental protections held. The land stayed wild. Occasionally, hikers would venture into that area, and most of them would emerge hours later with photographs of birds and wildflowers, with memories of peaceful solitude, with nothing unusual to report. But sometimes, a few of them would come out looking troubled. They'd describe feeling watched, feeling unwelcome. They'd mention the way the forest went quiet in certain spots, the way shadows seemed deeper than they should be. They'd talk about sounds that didn't quite match any animal they recognized, or smells that appeared and disappeared without source. Most people would dismiss these reports. Imagination, they'd say. Overactive minds responding to isolation and folklore. The power of suggestion. There was always a rational explanation, but the old-timers in Cedar Key would just nod, unsurprised. They'd known all along. Some places were different. Some places held more than trees and water and wildlife. Some places remembered, and the forest east of County Road 24 remembered Rebecca Ann Torrance. It remembered a young woman who'd walked into its depths with curiosity and courage, who'd documented the world around her with careful attention, who'd encountered something at the edge of her understanding and paid the ultimate price. Her story would become part of the landscape now, woven into the collective memory of the Nature Coast. Locals would tell it to newcomers, sharing it around campfires or in quiet conversations at the Cedar Key docks. Some would tell it as a cautionary tale about the dangers of isolation. Others would tell it as a mystery, a reminder that the world still held secrets. Patricia Torrance visited her daughter's grave regularly. Rebecca had been laid to rest in a cemetery in Atlanta, near where her mother lived, where family and friends could visit and remember. The headstone was simple, elegant, bearing her name and dates and a single line: she loved the water and the wild places. On the first anniversary of the verdict, Patricia drove to Cedar Key one final time. She walked the trails near County Road 24, staying on the marked paths, not venturing into the deeper woods. She stood at the edge of the forest and spoke quietly to her daughter, telling her that justice had been served, that she could rest now, that she'd been loved and missed and would never be forgotten. The wind moved through the pine trees, carrying the scent of salt and vegetation. Birds called in the distance. The afternoon light slanted golden through the branches. It was peaceful, almost serene, and Patricia felt something release inside her. Not forgiveness. She would never forgive what had been taken from her, but acceptance, maybe. Recognition that some things couldn't be changed, only endured, and eventually, slowly, healed. She left flowers at the trailhead, bright orange lilies that Rebecca had loved, and drove back to Atlanta. She wouldn't return to Cedar Key again. This chapter was closed. The rest of her life waited, however much of it remained, and she would live it as fully as she could. For herself, and for the daughter who never got that chance. The case files were archived, the evidence was catalogued and stored, the trial transcripts were filed with the clerk of court. Rebecca Ann Torrance became a closed case, a solved murder, another entry in the long history of crime and punishment and the endless human struggle for justice. But in certain places, on certain nights when the moon was new and the forest grew very quiet, you could almost feel her presence. Not a ghost, something more subtle than that. Just an echo, a memory imprinted on the land itself. The echo of a young woman who'd loved science and nature, who'd died too young, who'd become part of the place she'd been studying. And maybe, if you listened carefully, if you opened yourself to possibilities beyond rational explanation, you could hear something else too. Something moving through the trees, slow and deliberate, neither predator nor prey, but something in between. Something that had witnessed tragedy unfold, that carried its own unknowable understanding of what had happened. The nature coast remembers, the forest knows, and in the space between what we can prove and what we sense but cannot name, the mystery endures. Not as a question requiring answers, but as a reminder that the world is larger and stranger than our theories can encompass. That wilderness still exists in places where development hasn't reached and might never reach. That some stories resist simple endings. Thomas Earl Drummond died in prison 4 years after his conviction, his body giving out after decades of hard living. He never revealed anything more about that August day in 1993. Whatever secrets he carried went with him. Rebecca Ann Torrance remains in the collective memory of the nature coast, her story told and retold, evolving with each telling, but always returning to the core mystery. A young woman who walked into the woods and never came out. A case that was solved, but never fully explained. A reminder that truth exists in layers, and sometimes we only uncover the top ones. The forest east of County Road 24 stands silent, holding its secrets, waiting for the next person who ventures too deep, who stays too late, who encounters something at the boundary between known and unknown. And maybe that's how it should be. Maybe some mysteries are meant to persist, to remind us of our limits, to keep alive the sense of wonder and terror that comes from acknowledging how little we truly understand about the world we inhabit. Rebecca's notebook, recovered from the creek and preserved in the evidence archives, contains that final entry that started everything. The words are still visible, despite the water damage, the faded pencil marks recording her last observations, something moving through the trees. Too large for a deer, doesn't move right. What did she see in those final moments? What truth did she glimpse before the violence descended? We may never know with certainty. But the question remains, echoing through the decades, inviting us to consider possibilities that lie beyond comfortable explanations. Justice was served. The guilty were punished. The dead were remembered and mourned. And yet the mystery endures, because life is complex and truth is layered, and sometimes the most honest answer is simply, we don't know everything, but we know enough. We know Rebecca mattered. We know her story was told. We know someone fought for her even after 3 decades of silence. And in the end, maybe that's the victory. Not perfect answers, but persistent memory. Not complete understanding, but continued questioning. Not closure, exactly, but a kind of peace that comes from knowing the struggle for truth never stopped, even when the truth itself remained elusive. The Nature Coast remembers Rebecca Ann Torrance, and now so do we.